What's up, everybody? My name is Rusty. I'm here with the Value Vintage team. And for those of you who are just tuning in, you're probably wondering what this is. This is $30 Value Vintage or $30 Budget Vintage. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a format that uses the Vintage BNR, but the whole deck has to be 30 bucks or less. If that sounds like your thing, check out some more videos on the channel or join the Discord server through the link in the description, and you can check out some more information. Today, I'm going to be doing a deck tech and then playing a simulated league with this Cloudpost deck. Obviously, we don't have leagues on Magic Online, so I've got a couple of my mod team, and they're going to be facing off against me in 3 rounds today. I don't have time for 5, so just 3. I'm going to knock out a quick deck tech for anyone who's not seen Cloudpost before. Just as a note, we do run Magic Online events. We're striving to make sure we have at least one every month for the rest of the year. We also have plenty of free play going on in the Discord server on Magic Online and Cockatrice. I think there's 4 people playing right now as I'm recording this video. So if you do want to jump in, there are online options. But moving on to the deck tech. For those of you who aren't aware of what Cloudpost is, it's really only in older formats. Let's take a look at the actual card Cloudpost, and then a lot of this will make sense. It's a tap land that adds a colorless for each locus on the battlefield. Locus is a pretty unique land type. It's really only on, I think, 3 cards, plus some weird ones like from a commander deck. It's all land types. The important things are 4 copies of Cloudpost, 4 copies of Glimmerpost. The life gain associated with Glimmerpost is nothing to sneeze at. It can stabilize you against a lot of aggressive decks, put you out of range of burn decks, and I think it's a pretty strong draw to play Post instead of playing Tron in this format. Trench Post is a relatively new one. This is mostly here as an additional untapped locus, but there are certain matchups where having 2 copies of Trench Post, you can use the mill ability to make it honestly kind of free. If it's like a grindy control deck that doesn't have a way to shuffle its graveyard and doesn't have a way to combo kill you, a lot of the time you have a long game and then it comes down to Trench Posts. We also play 4 copies of Thespian Stage, which is kind of acting as redundant Cloud Posts or Trench Posts. And then a lot of enablers to find them. So we're playing 4 crop rotation. This is just the best way to find a land. And notably, it turns any hand that has forest and crop rotation into a turn 1 tapped Cloudpost, essentially. You'll see in some of the videos, this deck operates really, really differently when you have a turn 1 Cloudpost versus when you don't. Because if you don't have a turn 1 Cloudpost, your best situation is Ancient Stirrings or Star Ancient Stirrings to find one on turn 2. And that means you're not making mana off it until turn 3. If you had to play a forest in there, then you're going to be moving pretty slow. So the fact that crop rotation is semi-conditionally 4 additional copies of Cloudpost makes it really good. I'll pull up the Moxfield list for a second. I think we're going to do most of the deck tech on Modo because we can see the cards, but we're going to show the prices for a minute. It's not pretty. Crop rotations are nearly $2.20 each right now. That's the largest single expenditure in the deck, followed by Golos. It's tough. I actually just cut Sol Ring for budget. I know some people are going to yell at me for that, but the Golos are very important. The crop rotations are very important. The Gigantha is important. So there's not a lot of wiggle room right now. So just you can kind of see where we're spending our money. Dark Depths being just above $2 is really exciting. Trench Post being functionally free is exciting, and Gigantha actually dropped about 30 cents thanks to getting banned in Modern, so a little bit of extra room here. We are pretty tight right now. I do wish that I had Leyland of the Void instead of Ravenous Trap, but we'll talk about that when we talk about the sideboard. As far as the actual game plan goes, there's really not that much going on in the deck. There are Cloudposts, ways to find Cloudpost, crop rotation, Sylvan Scrying. Explore is not really a way to find it, but it is a consistency piece. Ancient Stirrings are really good because they find you your Cloudpost and they also find you your threats because they're all colorless. As far as threats go, I'm on 2 Endbringer, 4 Battle Balls, and 4 Golos. Golos himself is not really a threat, but he's really, really important and really useful because we can play him early off of a Cloudpost, and he can either get us another Cloudpost, or he can grab us our 1 of Crystal Quarry, which lets us spend him for 9 mana total, because you're putting 8 in. Yeah, so this counts as a mana. So it's like 9 mana to spend him, which can be really threatening. Additionally, you can sometimes get your oddball value lands, like Blast Zone, thrown in the High City. We also have a Dark Depths down here. We're a Forced Thespian stage crop rotation deck, so adding Dark Depths gives us like some extra oomph, basically. I've played the deck with and without it. When you don't have Dark Depths, it really does feel like you're missing like a pretty critical way to pressure your opponent. I would not recommend trimming the Dark Depths. I think it's very important. Additionally, we also have Gigantha. Recently banned in Modern Gigantha. I think this may be the best Gigantha deck in the format. 8 mana is really, really doable in this deck, and Gigantha allows you to do something like deploy an early Golos, get a Cloudpost, usually your second, and then deploy like a Gigantha to go alongside your Golos. So when you're against like a control or a mid-range opponent, you're kind of forcing them to deal with those two threats, which are pretty low investment, right? The Golos already got us our Cloudpost. The Gigantha came from the command zone. So we don't really care if they board wipe us. And then after they resolve a board wipe, you can usually follow up with like a Mer Battle Sphere or something that's actually going to get the game closed out. So Gigantha's almost like... It's like an easy come, easy go, take it or leave it. Kind of like a little bit of just additional board pressure to force your opponent to do something. If you suspect they're holding up a counter spell, or they might have like a targeted removal spell, you can kind of just throw the Elk into it pretty easily. Additionally, against like aggressive disruptive decks, whether they're like Hymn to Turok or like Thalia Elite Spellbinder decks, Gigantha is really, really eminently castable. It costs 8 mana total, but it is in the installment plan of 3 and then 5. So if you're not able to get like your multiple Cloudpost plan online, and you're not feasibly going to cast a Battle Ball, usually you can like cast a couple Explorers, and then it's not that hard to play like a turn 4 Gigantha, which can block a lot of stuff on the ground and give you more time to set up your bigger plays. One thing that's worth noting here is we don't actually have a lot of green mana. This deck is functionally a colorless deck that I would say is splashing green for a few cards. We have 7 Stars and Spheres, and we have 8 actual green lands. It's really interesting because you don't want to put a forest into play in the early turns. You really want to be focusing on developing your locust count so that when you do have a Cloudpost tapping for mana, or you are able to find a Cloudpost, you can use it to make 3, 4, or 5 mana. I find that playing a forest in the first couple turns is pretty bad unless you're able to crop rotation it away. So I try to avoid doing that. I usually try to use my Stars and Spheres as my green mana for the first couple of turns, but this does have the side effect that sometimes you end up with an all-colorless mana draw, and if you don't find a payoff or some of your cantripping fixers, you can end up with some green cards rotting in your hand. I remember when I first started working on Cloudpost, I really assumed I was a channel deck, because we have these big 7-drops. I was even playing some bigger guys. But channel cuts you off Gigantha, and you also can't realistically have double green in this deck, so I'm pretty firmly against channel. I'm actually really firmly in the camp of Gigantha being like critically important, for the reasons I stated earlier. There are some cards I would play if the companion restriction didn't exist, or if Gigantha was like banned in Vintage, which wouldn't make sense. I would consider Pest Infestation. It's been really cheap. I've looked at Breaker of Armies. I think the what's that 7-mana Eldrazi that destroys a color spell, and also like does a deck manipulation thing as a pregame action. That could be interesting, but none of those are really in budget, and I actually don't think Breaker of Creation is very good. For those of you who don't know, Breaker of Creation it's double colorless, so we're not playing it for that reason, but it's an 8-drop that gains a bunch of life, theoretically, is basically hexproof and has Annihilator too. I was really interested in this card when it was spoiled. I thought it was going to be a big deal and busted, but it takes us off Gigantha, and notably, 8 mana is a lot more than 7 mana in this deck. Kind of like Tron, how Tron is good at making 7 mana through the 3 Tron lands. We are good at making 5 mana, 7 mana, and oftentimes like 11 or 13 mana. If you have... Let me move if you have Cloudpost, Glimmerpost, Trenchpost, or really any two non-cloud posts, your cloud post taps for 3, and then you play your third untapped Locust on turn 3, and that's 5 mana for a Golos on turn 3, which is really powerful. The other really common thing is cloud post, usually off of a crop rotation in the early turns, into untapped Locust, and that's 3, 6, 7 mana on turn 3, or 4 sometimes. When you're playing an 8-drop like Breaker of Creation, you don't get to play it off of this exact nut draw, essentially. So you're usually going to be playing it a turn behind, which in my opinion means that even though we make a million mana eventually, the fact that it's not ever going to be able to stabilize on turn 3 against really aggressive decks makes it kind of not worth considering 8-drops as far as I'm concerned. Additionally, I think it's really important for your threats to be resilient to removal. In the case of, I guess Breaker is, but the problem with Breaker is that occasionally your opponent can kind of just like attack around it. Like if they have 4/4/4s, they might just like attack. Endbringer gets a pass for being a little bit more castable, but I think Battle Ball is kind of the gold standard. It's nice that if they Swords to Plowshares it, you still have 4 little guys who are going to chip in and start eating away at your opponent's life total. If your opponent's an aggressive deck that plays like Terminates, for example, or Swords of their own, even if this gets answered, you have 4 chump blockers, which are going to buy you some time to your O-Stone or your next big play. I think it's really hard to get away with playing cards that just die. I do think Endbringer is a little bit more of a cheap spell than Mirror Battlesphere, which is like top end, so it gets a little bit of a pass. As far as alternate threats, I've played Steel Hellkite before. I wasn't impressed. I think Endbringer does everything it does better generally. Well, that's not true, because Endbringer obviously doesn't answer 1-mana permanents. I think Endbringer is just a really good solo threat. I like that it's pseudo-vigilant, so you can attack and be on defense. It cleans up a bunch of weird little guys, and against control, it is a 1-mana threat that can kind of win the game in a way that Steel Hellkite can't. If this goes unanswered for like a full turn cycle, you're up 2 cards, so even if they get a Swords to Plowshares, you're going to be that much closer to your next big threat. Whereas if this was a Steel Hellkite, you can chip in at your opponent for 12 damage or 15 damage. If they answer it, you're still going to be out of cards, and they're going to kill you. I think the last thing to really talk about is kind of these like one-of utility lands. Crystal Quarry obviously is for Golos. It's a bit of a gamble to get a Crystal Quarry off Golos, because that's kind of saying like you are banking on your Golos resolving, or I guess you're banking on it sticking around, right? If you choose to get a Crystal Quarry, the Crystal Quarry itself is pretty bad if your Golos is dead or exiled. Notably, it is a green source, although it does cost you a mana to filter and make timing a little bit weird. So if you are on a purely colorless draw, which happens sometimes, it's not uncommon for your first Golos to get a Crystal Quarry, so that either you untap and get to spend Golos, or you can filter through Crystal Quarry to cast some green spells and move to your next piece. Overall, pretty good. I would never cut it. Lair of the Hydra is just, part threat, part green source. I kind of go back and forth on whether this should be Lair of the Hydra or Generous Ent. Lair of the Hydra is a little bit cheaper, so that's where I'm at currently. Throne of the High City is a pretty good tutor target against control decks, although it can kind of bite you. You got to be really careful. And then Blast Zone is actually a pretty big part of our late game power. We don't have that many different utility lands, and if a Dark Depths isn't going to get the job done, or you've already used your Merit Lage, it's not uncommon to have a game where you get a Blast Zone, and then you copy it multiple times with Thespian Stage, and use your excess mana to like tick up all your Blast Zones to like 2, 3, and 4, and then use that to police your opponent's board state until you can get a game-ending threat online. And then the biggest one, Dark Depths. I would never play this deck in a tournament without Dark Depths, I don't think. It just turns your late-game bricks of like Sylvan Scrying and crop rotation into just like must-answer threats. Additionally, you don't always have to do the Dark Depths Thespian Stage thing, which for those of you who don't know, you copy Dark Depths with Thespian Stage. Thespian Stage doesn't have any ice counters because it's an enters the battlefield trigger, or just not a trigger, it just enters with. You keep the Thespian Stage that has no counters on it, and then you make a 20/20. It's really not uncommon to pay retail for this Dark Depths, It's only 30 mana over 10 activations. So if you have 3 Cloud Posts, a Glimmer Post, and a Trench Post, your Cloud Posts are all tapping for 5. That's 15 mana right there. So over the course of 2 turns, you can thaw out your Dark Depths without going down a land on your Thespian stage, and that lets you save your Thespian stage for Blast Zone or Lair of the Hydra activities. Sideboard is interesting. I think that it's really important to win the matchups that you can. Although I do think we're maybe a little overloaded on Graveyard Hate, and 4 Scoozes is probably too many. This is what I sent to SCG Atlanta with our team, and I was a little short on time for updating it. I don't know if this is exactly what I would play going forward, but I think it's important to have good Graveyard Hate. We have a really hard time with unfair combo decks that don't use the Graveyard. We really don't have any good plan for them. Damping Sphere is expensive and bad for us. Thorn of Amethyst is not realistic. Lodestone Golem, not realistic. So like High Tide is a nightmare matchup, and I don't know how much we can really fix that. I have played 4 Tsunamis in my sideboard before, just to say, like, this is my plan. I'm going to Tsunami you. Depends on your metagame. I think that it's important to not lose to graveyard decks like Dredge and Oops All Spells, so we try to respect those. Scavenging Ooze, I wouldn't really recommend for, but it helps with like the long-term graveyard situation on Luris decks, Martyr proc, things like that. It also helps stabilize first burn. Then we have some Spatial Contortions as removal for decks like Elves or like Thalia decks that's not bad against. And 1 additional O-Stone. I have gotten the feedback from people who borrow the deck that they sideboard the O-Stone in nearly every game, so there's a chance that 4 O-Stones main should just be mandatory. But I do think 4 O-Stones in your 75 is nearly mandatory. There's so many oddball decks like Thopter Sword or Enchantress, or even just like a Bant Snowco or a Bant Wilderness Wreck deck. They're going to play so many value permanents to the board, they're going to try to bury you. O-Stone just cleaning all of that up, in addition to being a creature board wipe, is just really, really useful. I think that's really all I have. If you guys have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the Discord. My name is Rusty. I'm very active on there. Or you can ask questions in the comments. If you think this is misbuilt, please let me know. I'm not saying I'm the greatest deck builder or player in the world, but I have put in a decent amount of time on Cloudpost, and I feel at least relatively confident about most of these choices. But yeah, I'll get you guys over to the games, and enjoy.